All right, here we are, part 8 in our series in the book of Acts. We're actually at a transition point in the book of Acts, so after today, we're going to pause our study in the book of Acts. I'm not sure when we'll come back to it, but we're going to hit pause. But before we hit the pause button, let's consider what this history book called Acts of the Apostle does for us, shall we? 3 things. First, Acts informs us. It informs us that Jesus' promises to his disciples were all fulfilled. John chapter 14 is how we actually started our study in the book of Acts. Let me go back there one more time. John 14, verse 12, Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he says to them, "Truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and will do even greater works than these, because I'm going to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, I will do it, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. And if you ask me anything in my name, I will do it. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another counselor to be with you forever." Jesus promised his disciples 3 things. He promised that they would keep doing what he'd been doing, and even greater works than he'd been doing, which seemed improbable at best, but that's exactly what we see happened in the book of Acts. Jesus promised that he would act when they asked him in his name. Which seemed like a complete role reversal when he said it, right? Because up to that point, he's the one asking and they're doing. And now he's like, here, now we're going to change it up. You're going to ask and I will do what you ask. And then Jesus promised that he would send them another counselor. The Father actually would send them another counselor, the Holy Spirit. And Acts informs us that that is exactly what happened. Every promise was fulfilled. Acts also informs us of how the church began and how it grew, and how they solved problems and survived opposition, even survived the war that we talked about in part 5. Now, as you think about that, though, Acts is telling us what happened, right? It's not primarily a book that's telling us what to do. It's a book that's telling us what happened. Some people describe it this way. They say Acts is more descriptive than prescriptive, right? It's more descriptive. It describes what took place rather than prescribing what it is we have to do. For example, the Jerusalem church had 7 deacons who ran a widow ministry, and one of the deacons preached in a way that got him hauled off to court and executed as a heretic. Our deacons are thrilled to know that we are not required here at PBC automatically, just because it happened in Acts, to have 7 deacons. The only ministry that they have is to oversee the widow ministry, and one of them is going to get executed. They're especially happy that we don't have to have that last part happen, right? PBC isn't obligated to do church exactly like the early church did. We see some principles there that we grab from that, and we follow some of those examples, but we're not obligated to do it exactly the way that the first church did. And neither is God. God is not obligated to do things in our life and in our church and our world exactly the way that he did in that particular time and place. So, Acts informs us. Number 2, Acts inspires us. As we were reading through the book of Acts together over the last 8 weeks, we came across stories of generosity that inspire us, at least me. There were stories of boldness. There were stories of prayer that was just really rooted in faith and confidence in God. That inspires me, right? To be bold, to pray with confidence. We read stories of community, stories of fellowship. The church in that day seemed to be in its purest form, didn't it? And there was just a bond that overcame so many divisions and so many things that could have torn them apart. And then, of course, we read stories of God's intervention and miraculous power. And that's inspiring too. We like to hear that stuff. We long for that. So it's not surprising that some people would push for a return to the days of the first church. Like, man, if we could just get back to that, then that would be awesome. That isn't a new thing, by the way. In my research, I found out there was a movement to try to get back to the good old days, to the early days of the early church, as early as about 100 AD. Because, there was something very attractive about what God was doing and about how this church carried itself. And I get that. I personally long for us to experience all that God says is possible. In fact, it's one of my prayers. God, I want to experience everything that you say is possible. And I want us to have stories Right? I want us to have stories of ways that we as individuals and ways that we as a church, we saw God intervene and we saw his power and we experienced the bond of friendship and camaraderie of soldier to soldier, shoulder to shoulder, right, among us. Stories of generosity, stories of God giving us boldness and things like that. I long for that to take place in our life. You know, years ago, there was a faithful, God-fearing prophet who longed for God to act and for God to restore his nation to the good old days. And he knew the stories of old, but when he looked out and he read the news, so to speak, when he's looking at his world, he's not seeing God do those miraculous stories like what he was taught as a boy. And he wasn't seeing it happen in his everyday experience. And he knew that God could do anything, so he prayed this prayer. This is Habakkuk. He was the prophet I'm referencing. This is Habakkuk 3, verse 2. This is his prayer. Lord, I've heard the report about you. Lord, I stand in awe of your deeds. Revive your work in these years. Make it known in these years. In your wrath, remember mercy. He's like, God, I know the stories, but I'm not living the stories. God, I want you to do it now. I want you to do it here where I am. God had told Habakkuk that judgment was going to come before restoration. And so he adds that prayer, God, in your wrath, remember mercy. Here's why I point that out. Reading Acts inspires me to pray this prayer of Habakkuk. I've found myself several times as I was reading through books of Acts and I'm seeing what God did and I'm seeing the unity that was there and I'm seeing them overcome the challenges and I'm like, God, I want to see that too. God, I've heard the report about you. This book of Acts is a report about you. God, I stand in awe of your deeds. Revive your work in these years. Make it known in my lifetime, God. So Acts informs, Acts inspires. Acts number 3 illustrates some key principles for us. I want to highlight just a very few. One that we saw very early in our reading in the book of Acts was this, that following Jesus affects every aspect of life, right? If it changes and affects every aspect of life, finances and leisure time and relationships and priorities and thoughts and emotions, and it just keeps going. In fact, I think what the scriptures would teach us is this. If following Jesus doesn't affect every aspect of your life, you probably only have religious beliefs about Jesus, not an actual relationship with him. Right? Following Jesus affects every aspect of life. That's one principle we saw illustrated so clearly in the book of Acts. Here's another one. God will give you what you need for your assignment. God will give you what you need for your assignment. A whole bunch of illustrations here. The apostles were called to be witnesses of the resurrected Jesus Christ. That was going to be their assignment. They're going to be witnesses of the resurrected Christ. So therefore, Jesus appeared to them and spent time with them after the resurrection and before returning to heaven. If they're going to be witnesses, they had to have that experience with him, and God made sure that they had it. The apostles were assigned the task of teaching basically a new gospel that claimed that they said was claiming that Jesus is God and that the message of salvation comes from God. So therefore, they were given the ability to perform signs and wonders. They said, like, this is a message that's supernatural, and so they were able to back that up with supernatural abilities. They were able to perform signs and wonders. I like how Chris Langham points out, he says, signs point and wonders make you wonder. And so the apostles, because of their unique ministry, they were able to do some very unique things. They were able to do these miraculous signs that pointed to, wow, there must be something supernaturally true about this message. This message really did come from God. And they were able to do wonders that made people really stop and think about it. Others in that Acts church, that first church, they were given the responsibility to financially provide for others. And so God gave them what they needed, right? They had resources that they could sell. And those early deacons had the ability to administrate things really well because that was going to be their assignment. So God gave them what they needed. Saul was going to be given the assignment of proving that Jesus is the Lord and Messiah. So therefore, when God converted him, he also connected the dots for him and helped him see in all the prophecies, like they really do line up in an irrefutable way to point out that Jesus is the Messiah. Let's jump to you and me. We don't have the same assignment as the apostles. We have some things in common, right? We're supposed to tell other people and show them, what a difference it makes to have God in your life, and then tell them as well how they can have a relationship with Jesus. So we have similarities, but there are differences too. Our assignment from God requires us to demonstrate, among other things, that we have unity in spite of diversity. We're not all alike, praise God for that, but we are one body. So therefore, think about what God did. God has given each and every Jesus follower at least one spiritual gift, right? Things like the gift of giving or teaching or leading or administrating or helping or whatever. But he doesn't give anybody all the gifts, but he gives everybody at least one gift. Why? So that way we are interdependent with each other. And when we do that, we demonstrate this unity in the midst of diversity, which is what we're called to do. It's our assignment. Let me go a step further, because sometimes when people read the book of Acts and they read about some of those supernatural gifts that are a little bit perhaps more flashy, like the gift of healing or something like that, they wonder, like, should I expect to see that in our church? Should there be somebody with the gift of healing or somebody with the gift of prophecy or tongues or something like that, some sign gift, something like that? And so they kind of wonder that. I believe that the consistent teaching of the entire Bible is that God will give you what you need for your assignment. So here's how this plays out practically for me. I believe that if God assigned me or one of you a new responsibility or a new ministry location, he would give you or me what we need for that assignment. I've seen this happen dozens of times. God puts people in a position where it's very clear they are supposed to. I remember one time in particular, a person was they were suddenly in a position where they were going to have to provide like shepherding type care to a group of people. And so by faith, all right, God, I'll do it, but that's not me. I remember them saying that. And then next thing you know, they suddenly seem to have this ability to do it. They had this gift of caring and shepherding for others. God gave them what they needed for their assignment. Well, let me give you another example, or maybe take it up a notch. I believe that if God had you move to some other city in the United States here, and where there was a subculture that was, basically the people from that culture, they're immigrants maybe, and they just have no experience with God whatsoever. But they come from a background where they believe that truth is always validated through dreams. Then here's what I would expect to have happen. If God assigned you to try to reach that group of people, I would expect that as you begin to tell them about Jesus Christ, that some of those people would suddenly start having dreams. Because remember, we talked about this last week, it's not about formulas. God is way bigger than the formulas. But what God, right, he's not like, okay, I can't do that anymore. I can't give anybody that ability or that gift. I'm not there. God is absolutely determined. I keep saying this, God is absolutely determined to offer reconciliation and restoration, right? And so if you and I get assigned a role by God, that God is going to give us what we need for that role. And I think Acts illustrates that in a very beautiful, powerful, potent, visible kind of way. One more story from Acts before we hit that pause button. This is Acts chapter 12, verse 3. Herod proceeded to arrest Peter too during the Festival of Unleavened Bread. And after the arrest, he put him in prison and assigned 4 squads of 4 soldiers each to guard him, intending to bring him out to the people after the Passover. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was praying fervently to God for him. When Herod was about to bring him out for trial, that very night, Peter, bound with 2 chains, was sleeping between 2 soldiers while the sentries in front of the door guarded the prison. And suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. Striking Peter on the side, he woke him up and said, get up. And the chains fell off his wrists. Get dressed, the angel told him, and put on your sandals. And he did. Wrap your cloak around you, he told him, and follow me. So he went out and followed him, and he did not know that what the angel did was really happening, but he thought he was seeing a vision. And after they passed the first and second guards, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened to them by itself. Then they went outside and passed one street, and then suddenly the angel left him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's grasp and from all that the Jewish people expected." And as soon as he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many had assembled and were praying. He knocked at the door of the outer gate, and a servant named Rhoda came to answer. She recognized Peter's voice, and because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing out at the outer gate. "You're out of your mind," they told her. But she kept insisting that it was true, and they said, "It's his angel." But Peter, however, kept knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were amazed. God answered prayers, didn't he? Yeah, you can see it. God answered prayers. Peter was delivered. The church got another faith-building story. Remember the time. Remember the time we were praying for days. We were praying for Peter, and then boom, the night before his trial, God, the angel rescued him. The church got another faith-building, prayer-motivating story. Now, I don't know this next part, but if their church was like our church, they possibly also got a story that they used to give each other a hard time, like, "Hey, Rhoda, go see who's knocking at the door," kind of thing. It's like, very funny. It's not like any of you guys believed me, kind of thing. I don't know. An amazing story. A miraculous deliverance, right? Do you know what happened right before that story? Let's go back. This is Acts chapter 12, verse 1. About that time, King Herod violently attacked some who belonged to the church, and he executed James, John's brother, with a sword. And we saw that it pleased the Jews. He proceeded to arrest Peter too. Yeah, James' execution precedes Peter's deliverance. James wasn't rescued. And then the other thing that hit me in that was the Jews were happy about his death. It kind of reminds me of that scene about Ebenezer Scrooge, right, in A Christmas Carol, where he's being led by the ghosts of Christmas yet to come, right? And he looks and he sees these people, and they're all glad that some guy died. Except here's the thing: James is nothing like Scrooge. James deserved better. James deserved a miracle too. James was as much a pillar in the church as Peter was. And it hits me as I think about this, that for every story of Peter delivered from prison, there's an execution of James, right? For every story in the book of Acts of someone being rescued, there's someone else who's having to pay the ultimate price. For every story of sweet fellowship between believers, there's a story of opposition and running for your life, of scattering, which leads to a question then. Why hang on to your faith if miracles aren't guaranteed? And why stay devoted when you're just as likely to have people turn on you as you are to experience the deepest form of community? And you can just keep asking questions like this: why? And at the heart of all those why questions, like why hang on to your faith and why persevere and why keep going, is this question: is it worth it? Is it worth it? I want to refine the question, though, just slightly so we get a more accurate answer, shall we? Instead of is it worth it, is Jesus worth it? Is Jesus worth it? We just read about how Peter was miraculously delivered. Later on, Peter wasn't miraculously delivered. In fact, Peter was crucified. And according to the tradition that's been passed on down, the story is that at his request, he was crucified upside down. When it came time for him to be crucified, he's like, I'm not even worthy to die like Jesus. And Peter had no regrets as they took him out and they crucified him upside down. Why? Because Peter believed that Jesus was worth it. That's the third principle that Acts clearly illustrates. This belief, this conviction that Jesus is worth it. Absolutely worth it. If you get a miracle, that's awesome. But if you don't, Jesus is still worth it. That was their message. If you get to stay in the town where you're living with your friends and your family and your small group, and then that's awesome. But if not, if you have to scatter and you have to go make new relationships somewhere else and you have to take a risk of telling those people there about Jesus Christ, it's okay because Jesus is worth it. That's what Acts so clearly illustrates, this conviction that Jesus is worth it. Now, if you're a little older, you might remember a little saying, maybe it's still around or whatever. Here it is. Ready? What would you do for a Klondike bar? In church on Sunday, I've been thinking through, like, how do I want to illustrate this? And will I bring people up on stage? Will I actually have Klondike bars? I was going to do that originally, but it's hard to keep them cold. And yeah, there's problems giving people melted ice cream at church. So I've been thinking through how I'm going to do that. But that's the question. Like, what would you do for a Klondike bar? That's what the advertisers want you to ask. And what they're trying to do and all that is, get you to be absolutely reminded, oh man, I need a Klondike bar, and I would drive to Wegmans or I would whatever to get one, right? Because a Klondike bar, that's just incredible. I saw a sign in a coffee shop not too long ago. Here it is. It says, I wouldn't do anything for a Klondike bar, but I would do some pretty sketchy stuff for coffee. Evidently, coffee is, ready? Worth it. Right? I'll risk some things. I'll do some things for coffee. Evidently, coffee is worth it. Let's bring this back. What would we do for Jesus? I'm not trying to get in your face, but I'll personalize. What would you do for Jesus? What challenge would you persevere through if Jesus walked through it with you? What cost would you pay if it meant pay it or turn your back on Jesus? What assignment would you accept from Jesus if you were confident that it would somehow bring him glory? What would you do for Jesus? As we ponder that, let's just do a very quick review in closing of the 3 reasons, at least, why Jesus' followers in the book of Acts were so convinced that Jesus is worth it. Here they are. Number 1, God's forgiveness is more necessary than life. You can live through this life without it, although not as well as you should, but you can't survive the next one. God's forgiveness is more necessary than life, and through Jesus, we have God's forgiveness. Second, God's reward for those who endure persecution because of him is so great, so immense, so rewarding, that rejoicing while we're being persecuted makes sense. And Jesus will see to it that we receive that reward. And then third, God's love is better than life. And through Jesus, we are loved with an unconditional love and an unbreakable love. Read Romans chapter 8, verses 31 through 39. Acts illustrates for us. It's the story of person after person after person who said, Jesus is worth it. That's how they answered. How are we going to answer? I want us perhaps this week to sit in the tension, but also in our perhaps growing resolve as we ponder that. Is Jesus worth it?